Hello everybody, and welcome to the final public debate of the term. Before I introduce the debate, I'd just like to thank Louise. She's been a fantastic debate officer this term, and she's put together a terrific debate again. The question we ask ourselves tonight is, can we be good without a God? Questions of morality date back as far as philosophy itself. Plato's seminal work is on the source and location of morals and morality. He identifies it in the form of the good, and that we should strive towards it for the sake of our souls. It is an external and objective thing. Similar arguments have been at the centre of classical theism about morality since Augustine. We should strive to be like God in his infinite kindness, wisdom, and love. We should do this for the sake of our souls getting into heaven, and that's the prime backing that this philosophy brings. Not only is there an abstract conception of the good, but also a more direct one manifests itself in the form of religion. There are rules to follow, scripture to read, and figures with a connection of God to listen to. Such clear commandments and directives make morality objective for the religious person. There are things which are always good and always right. There are no clear rules in atheism, however, which make grounding any form of objective morality much harder. Relativist morality in atheist circles is on the rise, starting relatively recently. Towards the end of the 19th century, Dostoevsky wrote, "If there is no God, everything is permitted," at around the same time that Nietzsche began talking about a complete rejection of religious and moral principles. The 20th century saw a great rise in social constructionist thought, with philosophers such as Foucault and Sartre advocating the position of nihilism. It also seems clear amongst atheists of today that the idea of an objective morality is implausible to them, or ridiculous, and that subjective morality is the only game in town. Do objective moral truths exist? Do we require a God to give them authority? Is the influence of a God the thing that makes them moral? Or is morality simply an evolved capacity of humans? Are moral rules the resulting cultural inheritance, a code which enables us to live more fulfilling, better lives? On the proposition tonight is our first speaker, Abdullah Andalusi. Mr. Al-Andalusi is an international speaker and activist, co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative. Joining him is Father Henry Wansbrough. Father Wansbrough is a biblical scholar and monk at Ampleforth Abbey, Cathedral Prior of Norwich. He is a member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission for 12 years. On the opposition, we have David Pollock, chair of the Rationalist Association. Mr. Pollock is also the publisher of the New Humanist magazine. And joining him is Andrew Copson, chief executive of the British Humanist Association, regular contributor to The Guardian and New Statesman. I would now like to welcome our first speaker to open the case that stands in his name, Mr. Al-Andalusi.
Can everyone hear me okay? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most gracious, most merciful. What a very interesting debate topic. And you've probably heard this topic being debated all over the place. Especially, it's become a very kind of relevant discussion amongst atheists and theists of various kinds. And I think it is related to obviously a lot of the many events in the world we see today. So, how to base societies, political philosophy. So, is it secular societies, common societies, or theocratic societies, or nomocratic societies based on theistic beliefs? So there are various discussions as to where to ground law, where to ground values, where to ground morals. And I would say that without God, there is no external existence to morality. Morality is just an idea or a concept in your brain. The idea of a unicorn is also an idea or a concept in your brain. It doesn't exist outside. And we could all act and pretend like unicorns exist and so on, and draw nice pictures of them and aim to to ride one or whatever, if we ever found one. But it doesn't mean it exists. It's like the king who had no clothes. He went around pretending he had clothes, didn't make it true. So what is then morality? Well, I would say that morality is a value given by the creator of our very purpose of existence, the very purpose of our existence, was created, and like any purpose, what is good and bad is judged based on our ability to fulfill this purpose. So a car that doesn't have an engine is not a good car, it's a bad car. It's not fulfilling its purpose. That's where the definition of morality I'm presenting today comes from. Now, let's look at the opposite side. They would say that, well, you can ground morality based on, an atheist can be selfless. I'm sure, of course, and there are people who can go around believing that the world is flat. Just because the human can compartmentalize their mind and act in one way, even though they believe something different, doesn't mean that morality can be based on without a conceptual anchor for that. I mean, look at it like this. You could say, well, we should all live selflessly, but your experience of the world is singular, right? You don't experience other people's experience of this world. If you're unhappy and other people are happy, it doesn't make you happy necessarily. Right? If you have to lose out because someone else gains, that doesn't necessarily make you happy. At the end of the day, if everyone left you alone, in some dark corner of the world, with your misfortunes, but other people were happy, that doesn't make you a happy person. People who are starving, let's say in parts of Africa, aren't happy because people are having their bellies filled in Europe. So your experience of existence is singular. So then why would you now act counter to your experience of existence? So for example, let's say if you were a mother or father and your child, your only child who you had raised, for instance they were a baby and you'd done everything for their future. Say this child committed a crime. Let's say they murdered somebody in some drunken bout of anger, or it was just happened at a crime of passion. And they were going to face life in prison if you reported them. What would you do? If you report them and do the moral thing, you'll be unhappy because that's your entire life's work, so to speak. Obviously, looking after your child, gone down the drain. So would you do it? Would you follow what's morally right, even though it's not going to benefit you at all whatsoever? And maybe your child could change their way. Maybe they'll learn from this. So maybe they won't do it again. So why put them in prison for some moral value? If you don't believe there's any high accountability, then why not? Why not just prevent your child from going to prison? What about the universe? Well, the universe doesn't really care whether you live or die. It doesn't even care whether you existed or never existed. The only morality in the universe, the only good and bad in the universe, is the possible and the impossible. That's the only morality of the universe, cause and effect. That's the only morality that exists in the universe. The universe doesn't give us a basis for morality. What about the change in progress of life? Some people will also use the word evolution. What does evolution say about good and bad, or the change in progress of life? What does that say? It doesn't really say anything. What you see is the strongest creatures generally survive, or the ones which can, and generally in nature, the sacrificing of the weaker creatures, which might endanger the collectives. But like, for example, ants. Okay, ants are collective creatures, yes. And you might say they're very altruistic, but basically, ants which aren't getting with the program, ants who are being individualistic within that collective, will be, in many ant colonies, are executed or basically excluded from the collective because they are a burden upon the collective. So in the natural world, we don't see morality as anything except just what benefits survival, possibly. Even when they say, look at monkeys and apes and look how altruistic they are. Oh yeah, of course. But why are we picking and choosing? Because they are also violent, warlike. Some are cannibals. Why don't we pick those examples and say, yeah, if we're going to go to animals to look for morality for how humans should live, then let's be holistic about it. Right, and if you look at just humans ourselves, we have a whole variety of actions and emotions, from altruistic to completely selfish. Who's to say which one is our natural state? Who is to say that? Maybe it's all part of our natural state. So it's just arbitrary, without a final, determinant, and that determinant being based on our purpose. If there's no God, there's no purpose behind creation, there's no way to judge whether anything we do is good or bad, because we can only judge good and bad related to our purpose. What about society? Well, they say, I don't want to live in a society where everyone's running around killing each other, so let's have some enlightened self-interest. Let's invoke, Thomas Hobbes, and create a self-interested society based on it was enlightened self-interest, basically. But there's a problem with making society your god to determine your morality. The problem is that, yes, you might create society based on maybe equality and reciprocation, but I would argue that the idea of equality and reciprocation are also causes for what you might call immorality. And I'll give you an example. We'd wish that we'd wish that, okay, between humans, everything should be fair. But the universe is not fair. Some humans are given better opportunities than others. Some humans are given better abilities than others. Some humans are given just blind chance, better fortune than others. And some humans are given better attributes for others. If the universe isn't fair with how it gives some humans more than other humans, some people are given more money than others, some people are given more opportunity to progress in the society than others, then why should you be fair if by playing by the rules, other people who have a natural advantage over you will excel beyond your capability and to your detriment? Right? I mean, like, okay, let's just take a normal situation that you as students might encounter. For example, maybe there are women here who've they fancied their best mate's boyfriend, and that guy, they think, that guy's better. He's actually, he's better for me than he is for her. Why does she get him? Why can't I get the nice guys? And then this might create envy. And isn't it, what they say, envy, right? Envy is merely the desire for equality. Because why is someone getting something that I'm not getting? Right? It's the desire for equality. That's what envy is. So then who decides what is appropriate to act in that situation? And people will undermine each other. People have undermined each other. There are various experiments, social experiments, done whereby people would actually spend their resources to undermine other people who have more resources in an experiment. There's very interesting experiments about this. Or what about reciprocation? And they say, well, you know what, to preserve society, there must be reciprocation. The problem is that even in that situation, it doesn't stop people from being immoral and viewing it as wise to be immoral. So, for example, okay, let's say you want to preserve your society by being adhering to the values of that society. What about other societies? You can still impinge their interests if it benefits you, because it doesn't affect your society. Vikings can go on raids. They can go as many raids as they want, and they can rape, pillage, and murder, and bring back all that booty back to their society. But their society still remains intact without anarchy. They have an ordered society. So, without morality to tell them yes, or what's wrong and right, and to tell them that that's wrong, the Vikings, who were very materialistic in that sense, they could happily go off and plunder others. There's other examples like the American and colonization. Britain's colonization of the world. They colonized other countries, dispossessed other peoples successfully with impunity, and there's no repercussions. Right? There's no one going to come back and the American Indians are not going to rise up against the Americans and kick them out. That's they're defeated. The Aboriginal Australia, they are defeated. There's no one going to get justice for them. And basically, if you look at it, it actually vindicates the colonialist. So where is morality? Who's to say that was wrong when it benefits your genotype, or your race, or your whatever, or your group, or your society? Who's to say that's wrong if you don't believe in a God? So I would say that basically religion basically tells people to do things which are counterintuitive to their interests. So if someone has more than you, then God intended that to be. Yes, you can excel yourself, but if that other person has more than you, accept it. That's God's will. In the hereafter, there will be a redress for this. In the sense of, if the more someone else is given, the more responsibility they get in front of God. So there is absolute equality preserved, but you have to believe in an afterlife to believe in absolute equality, which means if you believe in that, then that means you won't be so envious to basically tell people to undermine other people. So I will conclude with this. Basically, religion, or morality rather, tells humans to do things which are counterintuitive to their ultimate self-interests, whichever way you slice it. And because of this, it is the most effective preventer of immorality, of which I think a person that lacks a belief in God cannot find a justifiable reason beyond their subjective taste to do so. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for his speech and call upon Mr. Pollock to open the case for the opposition.
As Mae West once said, to err is human, but it feels divine. And so I stand before you as an exemplar of human errancy, if not moral depravity. That is, at least, according to the proposer of the motion, and according to, say, Archbishop Vincent Nichols, who holds that I, having rejected Christianity, must be intolerant and lacking in compassion. For he says, and I quote, "The virtues of compassion, respect, and tolerance cannot survive once they have been severed from their roots in Christian teaching." Or if you prefer your Christianity not to come from Rome, then the Archbishop of York says that in the absence of religion, and I quote, "moral responsibility will be displaced not by reason, science, or ethics, but by sheer consumerism." This is alarming, especially as 1 in 4 of the population in the 2011 census said they had no religion. What is more, as Abdullah has just shown in a series of fairly lurid distortions that nevertheless have some basis in truth, moral philosophers have, despite their valuable deep thinking, failed to come up with any knockdown argument about why we should be good. Command theory, intuition, reason, social contract, utilitarianism, virtue theory, and every other approach, every other attempt to find some solid ground under moral rules, have all failed to convince. Since the philosophers have failed to come up with an answer to this question, what is morality? What is good? And why should I let it govern my actions? Maybe there is no such answer. Would that matter? If we all stop believing in God and can find no moral philosophy to substitute for his commands, will we find ourselves all going to hell in a handcart? Well, it would matter very much indeed if we depended on having reasons for behaving well. If we were all inclined to act selfishly, cruelly, and deceptively, but were saved from doing so in the nick of time by the arguments of the philosophers or the threats of the priests, and we all became atheists and simultaneously realised there was no binding logical argument why we should behave well, then we could be in for a difficult time. And this is plainly what Abdullah fears. It's also what traditional Christians believe. They have that dreadful doctrine of original sin, that by choosing knowledge rather than blind obedience back in the Garden of Eden, Eve committed a sin so horrendous that all mankind ever since has been punished for it by being inherently wicked from birth. Without constantly being on guard, we will all behave viciously to the peril of our immortal souls. But think, are we naturally inclined to act selfishly, cruelly, deceptively? Occasionally, no doubt. But is that our fundamental nature? I think not. A much better description of our situation is that we all have a pretty good notion of what is right and wrong, about which, for the most part, we agree, so long maybe as we don't listen too much to philosophers and theologians, and that on the whole, but not invariably, we do what is right, and even if we don't, we know when we're doing wrong. Why should that be? Where do we get our ideas of right and wrong from? Note that this is an entirely different question from the one I started out with. The first question was, what is morally good, and why should I let it govern my actions? Now I'm asking, why, as a matter of fact, do I have this notion of actions being good or bad? And why do I generally act according to it? The first is a philosopher's question. The second is a scientist's. And so we ask, not what is the logical justification for morality, but what is the real-life origin of moral feelings? And the answer to this second question, I suggest, is that it's inherent in our nature to have moral sense, to have a moral capacity. Why? Because it helped us and our ancestors to survive over evolutionary time, and the instinctive patterns of behaviour that evolution left us with, instincts for cooperation, backed by social sanctions and by learned patterns of behaviour, enabled our ancestors to survive over millions of years, as against those various near relatives of ours who adopted other less cooperative patterns of behaviour and as a result didn't make it. These near relatives of our long ago ancestors are what Abdullah was describing. The powerful individuals unconstrained by social obligations, the egotists who are out to grab what they can, the followers of might is right. But think, are these the people you meet in your families, on the campus, in the street? Or are these culled from the worst imaginings of the Daily Mail and nightmares of Melanie Phillips? With a very few exceptions, ordinary people are not like that. And the exceptions tend to be the psychopaths among us, and the idealists who are led astray by some dogma that tells them that the end justifies the means. Those dogmas have included totalitarian communism and Nazism, but today they're largely religious. They're the homophobes of Westboro Baptist Church, and they're the murderers of doctors who do abortions, and they're the suicide bombers from the fervent fringes of Islam. So wake from those nightmares that Abdullah has conjured for you. Come down to earth and reality and make a sober assessment of our situation. I say again, our human capacity for moral thinking is a product of our evolution as social animals. It is usually in the interest of individuals living in a group to cooperate, to give and take, rather than to act in crudely selfish ways. All social animals have rules, that is, standards, set patterns of behaviour. And animals of many species besides our own behave in ways that look unselfish, look like cooperation, altruism, even self-sacrifice. Behaviour that evolutionary biologists can see is good survival strategy, not for the individuals, but for the genes that they carry. Think of meerkats with their elaborate arrangements for sharing the care of the young. Think of dolphins supporting injured and sick animals, swimming under them for hours so that they can be lifted up to breathe. Think of bonobo apes aiding injured and handicapped bonobos. Think of elephants caring for the dying and apparently mourning the dead. Humans are no exception. And we had already lived as social animals for millions of years before we were ever human. When we acquired the power of speech, language, maybe only 40,000 years ago, we seem quite naturally to have extended the idea of what was good from food that was tasty and cloth that was warm to people who were kind and behaviour that was helpful. No great leap, but it was the start of moral philosophy. So the idea of goodness, of morality, is a natural one for us, needing no divine sanction, though the priests and kings who wanted to ensure orderly behaviour in society quickly gave morality divine backing, and so started all the confusion. And so, unsurprisingly, there is in fact a huge degree of agreement across time and across the world about basic moral values, because they always relate to people living together in society. How else to explain that the so-called golden rule is found in pretty well every religion and every ethical system, dating back not just to the Jains and the Carvaka and Confucius, about 500 or 600 years before the Common Era, but even further to Egypt in the first half of the second millennium BCE, that is almost 4,000 years ago. Cooperative moral behaviour is a natural phenomenon. Yes, certain aberrant individuals exist who behave in unreliable ways, even wicked ways by our standards, but that is the case even in societies where there is universal religious belief. Circumstances and the extent of our knowledge mean that the shorthand rules that we learn in childhood vary in detail from time to time and place to place, but the basic story is that we humans are endowed by evolution with a moral capacity. We live socially in groups and have an instinct to conform to the rules of the group. This forms the basis of our conscience. Our consciences are pricked when we act contrary to the rules that are embedded deep in our nature. We, those of us who don't ascribe morality to a God, provisionally accept the general rules current in society, but we are ready to examine them to ensure that they are still relevant and well-tuned to changing circumstances. Revision does not threaten their moral character any more than the rejection by Christians of the rule in Exodus that anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death means that Christians now lead immoral lives. After all, the lives we lead are very different from those of our ancestors when the rules were formed, and circumstances alter cases. We have to answer for our decisions, and quite often there's no single right answer, but many plausible ones, and we have legitimately to choose between them on the basis of our view of priorities. Other people may decide in other ways, but we must respect their right to do so. So, to sum up, morality is an evolved capacity of humans. Moral rules are our resulting cultural inheritance. Philosophers and theologians may have failed to produce any knockdown arguments why we should be good, or even to determine what is good. They've not been wasting their time, however, because they've developed an invaluable range of concepts and a rich vocabulary that enable us to argue and reason in moral terms. We need this because our inherited moral rules and even our instinctive feelings, like the yuck factor, need to be kept under constant review as our knowledge advances and our capabilities change. Our inherited moral rules are neither eternal, inherent in the universe, nor arbitrary, changeable at will. Rather, they are our revisable attempt at a code that has to be adapted to enable us to live as a community, happy and productive and fulfilling lives. And there's no need for religion here, though the religious are, of course, welcome to contribute to the moral debate. Indeed, as Arthur C. Clarke once said, one of the greatest tragedies in mankind's entire history may be that morality was hijacked by religion. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for his speech and call upon Father Wansbrough to continue the case for the proposition.
Abdullah told us a bit about ants. I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that the World Authority on British fleas had an obituary in the Times this morning. So ants and fleas are slightly different, but if you want to discover about fleas, begin to look at that obituary. However, I'd like to take up from what David said. He began with quotations from two of my good friends, Archbishop Nichols, the Archbishop of Westminster, and Archbishop Sentamu of York. I agree with you, David, that those were not good statements. So I don't necessarily agree with them. I should begin by explaining my own position. I think I was invited to participate in this debate because I helped to produce a document of the Pontifical Biblical Commission called The Biblical Roots of Morality. The Biblical Roots of Morality. For the Christian, the roots of morality in the Bible. But I don't think that the Bible is the only book from which moral teaching can be necessarily derived. Some of you may have read Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, which contains an absurd presentation of the Bible, quite innocent of any literary criticism. It's the most extraordinary chapter showing how idiotic some of the rules in the Bible are. Well, if you take them literally, and if you take them out of their context, they are often extraordinary rules. But any sensible literary critic, any sensible user of an ancient document will understand it in its ancient way. The Bible's not a sort of shopping list of a ready reckoner of morality. It's got to be understood in its context. But biblical morality is not the subject of this debate. The subject of this debate is whether morality, and not specifically Christian or Muslim morality, requires a God. Whether it requires religion is another matter altogether. I think religion is our very deep feelings, how we understand the world, the shape of the world in our minds, how we can understand existence, how we can understand human relationships. And if we hold deeply to those, they are sacred for us. And that's what I think religion is. There is, after all, Tibetan Buddhism and some other types of Buddhism which don't have a God, but they are religions. So I think religion and morality do automatically go together. The question is morality possible without God? Can one deduce the existence of God from the existence of a code of conduct? And I don't think one can. But I would like to go a little way in that direction by producing an argument of Newman, who after all is your neighbour. He was in Birmingham. I don't know if there's a war between Warwick and Birmingham, but for a Yorkshireman like myself, they're near enough. Newman thought that conscience demands a God. Now, conscience is an essential element in morality, but it doesn't prescribe what is good and what is bad. It's the force which impels us to put into action the decisions we've made about what is good and what is bad. And Newman sees this to be an emotion like the emotion towards parents. If you obey a father, you have a nice warm feeling inside you. That comes from conscience. If you hurt your mother, you have a desolate feeling inside you. And that's conscience. Newman holds that this feeling of conscience implies that there is a person out there somewhere whom you are offending or pleasing. I don't think that's the case. I think it's not interpersonal, it's intrapersonal. If we follow our conscience, we have a nice warm feeling inside us, yes, but that's self-satisfaction. If we don't follow our conscience, then there is a desolate feeling because we've let ourselves down. So Newman reckons that conscience demands God. I don't think it does. A more direct question is how we reach the decision whether something is good or bad. Whether God's decision or sanction makes an action good or bad. And there, I don't think this is the case either. It was debated long ago in Plato's Euthyphro, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. If you aren't familiar, the first argument is an action good because it's pleasing to the gods, or is an action pleasing to the gods because it's good? Don't put the cart before the horse. An action is pleasing to God because it's good, but what makes it good? And that's the first thing you have to decide. And I think there we slip in another ancient philosopher, Aristotle, with a glance at a more modern philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre. Aristotle's ethics are teleological, and he reckons that everything has its telos, good or bad. I think this is sound. You don't use a golf club as a fire poker. You don't use a pen to cut up your food. They have their particular purpose. You don't wrap your fish and chips in 20-pound notes, I hope. Similarly, in human morality, see how a human being works best, or rather, see how human beings, in the plural, work best. On the whole, we work better if we walk on our feet rather than our hands, and play the piano with our hands rather than our feet, though pianists have been known who play the piano with their feet. Certainly drawing with their feet is possible. So everything has its purpose. One mustn't be too prescriptive. What are lips for? Are they for eating, for kissing, or for speaking? Several purposes. But they do have a telos, they do have purposes which one needs to keep to. One basic fact is that we work best in society when we can help each other, advise each other, learn from each other, and provide the talents that another lacks. And because of this, some pieces of morality are obvious. One function of speaking is to communicate knowledge, and it works best if we tell the truth. If nobody tells the truth, then communication would be very difficult. So speech has a particular purpose. The very young and the very old need special fostering and protection. That's an obvious matter for interpersonal behavior. In at least some societies, sexual partnership works best if it's one-to-one. I'm a firm holder in monogamy, but is that just a Christian quirk? Is it a Christian quirk that life is sacred and therefore we don't have the right to dispose of it? We've got to work out that from what works best in society. Most of us need a certain amount of possessions for our personal security and satisfaction, and therefore we need to hang on to them. Indiscriminate killing destabilizes society, but there may be occasions when killing is possible, when killing is good. And for a long time, civilized society held that the death penalty was civilized. Civilized society now has a lot more doubt about this. You'll have noticed, I think, by now, that I'm working through the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. But putting, I hope, the positive values of them. So does God enter into the question at all? Not necessarily. Of course, if you accept that life is a gift of God, this provides a new outlook on everything. It includes acceptance as genuine of the religious experience of certain particular persons, such as Abraham, the friend of God, or the Buddha, or Jesus of Nazareth, or Muhammad. This religious experience may include indications of the way God wishes you to live, wishes you to behave, and this we call revelation. A genuine religious experience will in many respects coincide with the truth of human values achieved by human wisdom in the way that I described from Aristotle, from the teleological argument, that everything has its purpose and has to be used according to that purpose. But I think the truths about human nature and human relationships expressed in the Hebraic Christian creation myths are wise. The relationship between man and woman, the equality between man and woman, the duty of human beings to look after creation, and so on. So in those cases, the religion and God coincide. But I think the basic way in which we discover what we need to know about behavior and morality is through looking at how things work best and how we need to use the talents and the gifts that we have in the way that they work best. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for his fine speech and call upon Mr. Cobson to second the case for the opposition.
Thanks very much. Well, I, of course, agree entirely with all the arguments just given for why morality doesn't require a God, though I stop there and don't go on to talk any more about God. And I also agree with everything that my colleague David has already said about the origins of morality. I think he's already given a very clear and perfectly correct account on the available evidence of the origin of morality in human beings. And I think all the evidence that's uncovered progressively from biology and anthropology from time to time has continued to reconfirm that case. So I'm not going to talk anything more about the origin of morality. I accept totally that all the evidence points to it being an evolved capacity of human beings. I am going to talk briefly about morality in another sense, and then come on to address some of the points that have already been made by Abdullah. Because we've been talking so far mainly about morality at quite a theoretical or abstract level. But the motion being morality requires a God, I think it's legitimate to look for a moment at morality in the sense of simply people doing good. People actually doing good, benefiting other human beings, perhaps other animals, creatures, and the general world around them. Because I think that if you're going to try and mount a complete and comprehensive case that morality requires a God, then I think you need at the very least for people who believe in God to be demonstrably more moral in practice. To be demonstrably more benefiting of their fellow human beings and of the world around them. And I think it's quite important to point out that doesn't appear to be the case. At least in the UK, measures like the Citizenship Survey, which look at how great a percentage of people with different religions or beliefs do things like volunteer in charities to help others, engage civically, give to charity and give of their time and so on, reliably again and again find that there is essentially no difference between the percentage of non-religious people who don't believe in any God who do those sorts of things and various percentages of religious people who do. It's quite well known that 2/3 of charities in the UK at least are secular, don't have any religious basis, and although of course there may be many religious people working with them, there are also always a sizable proportion of non-religious people, people who don't believe in any God. And you all know from your own personal experience, people who do believe in God who are not very nice, have done some pretty nasty things, don't behave in a particularly beneficial way to other people, and you know some people who don't believe in God who do behave in a way that is beneficial to other people, and of course you know people in both categories the other way around. But for our side of the debate this evening, I think it's sufficient that you do know plenty of people who don't believe in God who do behave morally in practice. And I think that moral behaviour in practice has to be an important part of this debate, not just morality in theory, and not just the origins of morality, but morality in practice. There's a huge amount, of course, of academic literature on this. There may be anthropologists and psychologists here today, I'm sure there are, but it was sufficient to say, at the very least, that a large number of studies again and again have found that religion as a factor, belief in God as a factor, is largely neutral when it comes to morality. Even quite large-scale studies of quite serious sorts, like the study that was done of people who helped Jews escape the Holocaust in Europe under the Third Reich, where investigators went in thinking that they would find some really strong religious correlations here. You know, who is going to have been most likely to have saved people from the Holocaust? Probably people with some sort of religious belief or belief in God. Found that religion was almost completely a material factor, and all the factors that predicted whether or not people would help people in practice to escape things like the genocide were to do with something else, were to do with education, were to do with social background, and so on and so forth. So, anyway, I'm sure that you'll have more examples from the floor when we get onto questions of studies that show similar things. It's enough for the moment for me to point out that in practice, godless moral behaviour is widespread, and of course, godly immoral behaviour is also sufficiently widespread to call into question the idea that morality requires a God. I want to consider very briefly whether or not the problem that was identified by Abdullah is actually a problem, the problem of there being, in a godless view of morality, no external source for notions of right and wrong. Because I think that is a serious point, a point that should be engaged in. I think it's important to point out that a godless conception of morality is not necessarily one in which morality is an arbitrary matter. It's not necessarily one in which morality can just be invented or reinvented or redecided by any individual human being. It's perfectly possible for the source of morality to be wider than just the individual, but nonetheless not external to humanity generally. I think that's a very important point. If you look around for the closest you can get to some sort of objective moral values, whatever that word is going to mean, I think it is perfectly possible to find them grounded in human experience, grounded in common humanity, the common human experience of today, here and now, but also the common human experience of the previous centuries and millennia. It's perfectly possible for that to be a sufficient source of moral truth without recourse to any external source. And I think that we realise this is the case if we consider what even people who believe the opposite are actually doing when they're making moral decisions. Say that you're a person who does believe that morality is transmitted from an external source through revelation. And you're faced with one of the many scriptures of which this claim is made. Straight away you're faced with a challenge, because there is in almost every self-proclaimed source of divine moral authority a contradiction or two. There may be things that clearly conflict one with the other, or there may be values that are presented as equally necessary to be followed, but which in practice conflict. Can you honour your father and mother if your father is a war criminal who should really be giving up before he goes to his next genocidal day at work? Okay. Actually, it's a bit of a difficult decision. Well, hopefully not that difficult. But it's at the very least a decision. It is an occasion on which you have to decide which of the authoritative principles you are going to follow. So what do you need to do when you're faced with that decision? Well, you need to look at these two principles. You need to think about the context that you're in. You need to weigh one against the other. You need to think about the consequences of choosing one against the other. You need to be self-reflective. Think about your own principles in this situation. What does it say about you, depending on which moral choice that you're going to make? You need to go through that dynamic process of moral reasoning in order to decide which of the two principles, authoritative principles, you're going to follow. And I can't see that it makes any difference whether or not, in practice, you think that those different possible courses of action are mandated for you by a God, or whether you just have identified them for yourself as possible values that you're going to follow. It is no exit from the reality of moral choice and moral responsibility to say that morality, the source of morality, is an external God. You still have to do at least part of the work yourself. Now, under my conception, you have to do all the work yourself, but even under a conception of a divine authority, I think you have to do some of the work yourself. And so there's no real difference between the two. The last thing I want to take on is this idea that came out a little bit in what Abdullah was saying, when he said that if you didn't have something, and this is a rough characterisation of what he said, the gist of it was, if you didn't have something bigger than you or than all of us, then you would be reduced to making the source of your morality something to do with your singular experience. And your singular experience wouldn't do because it's internal and singular and essentially self-centred. Well, I would want to deny that any human experience really is singular. I don't experience my own life, the reality of my lived life, in a singular way. And I don't think any of us do. We all experience our lives in relation to other people all the time. The people around us are the people who raised us, our family, our friends, the people we go to university with, the characters that we see in literature. All the time we're engaged in feeding off and feeding into other people's actions, beliefs, society, and we exist in relation to other human beings. I don't think there is such a thing really as a singular human being in the way that it was caricatured. And I think that that's the source, one of the principal sources of morality. Why is it that you can look at a disaster happening halfway across the world and feel moved to do your bit to help out in that disaster when you see the suffering of the people there? It's not because you're a singular person. It's because you see yourself in that other person. You know that it's all part of human experience. You know that nothing that happens to another human being could not happen to you if the circumstances happened to be so. So for me, certainly, the source of morality, obviously the origin of morality as a matter of historic fact, is in our evolved capacity. But also morality itself is a very human affair. It is generated by people's interactions with each other. It's relational. And I think, in fact, it's much better for morality to come from that warm sympathy between human beings than the much colder, chiseled commandments of some objective authority, which in any case can never influence your behaviour without you actively choosing to let it. Thanks.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for his fine speech, and we now come on to the floor debate. The way this is going to work is everybody in the audience has the ability to ask the panel a question or sort of put forward a statement. Please, when you ask a question, phrase it and direct it in a way in which both sides could answer. So do not sort of pick a speaker and say, Mr. Cobson, what do you think on this issue? Say, what do the panellists think about this issue or argument or whatever it may be? And I would like to start with a question from the back right there.
Okay. For the panel, for the opposition bench, your position's like quite philosophically incoherent, really. Because if morality is, as Mr. Pollock says, something that's merely evolutionary useful, the concept of morality and of right and wrong is itself redundant. We don't need to ask whether something is morally right or morally wrong. We can just say, is it evolutionarily useful for the human race? Okay. Which means when Mr. Copson then gets up and says, well, atheists can act in a morally good way, it's like a trivially obvious truth. But you can't act morally because, your concept of morality itself is something that's merely something that is evolutionarily useful. So on that basis, will you say that the list of atrocities committed by the human race over the course of its existence is something that was merely evolutionarily unhelpful at the time? And if you won't, why?
You always have to be suspicious of people who preface words with other words like merely or solely or only, as if to pre-trivialise the propositions that they're putting into your mouth. Do you want to take on the evolutionary point first? I mean, it seems to me there's a clear distinction between giving an account for the origin of something and then saying that that same process should be the arbiter of our moral actions today. I mean, what David's position, if I'm not getting it wrong, is that here is an account of how what we now call morality, using our conscious minds, came to be. And it did not come, it wasn't beamed into us at some historically specific point by some external divine authority. It's not dependent on that moment in human history. Instead, it was something that developed in our species over time. It clearly has a biological foundation, but that foundation is built on by human culture consciously over millennia and centuries as well. That seems to me, although it establishes, although it's an account for the origin of morality, it doesn't go on to therefore say, and the requirements of evolution should somehow form a basis for our values today. In fact, there seems to be no necessary connection between those two at all. I can't see it.
Not only that,
would someone from the proposition like to continue this discussion? We've got to be quick, fortunately. Sorry. It's fine.
Well, you know what? It's a very good point. It's about evolution and morality. Churchill believed that imbeciles should be sterilised and various other miscreants should be sterilised because it was going to weaken the genetic pool of the British peoples. And he came from it from a very social Darwinist perspective. And according to social Darwinism, it does seem to be it makes sense, right? To reduce weakness in the gene pool in your own race would guarantee that future generations would have stronger genes and wouldn't suffer from various illnesses or ailments. So I would say that it's a counter argument could be made from a purely materialistic basis, using evolution to justify legitimately, according to that basis, the very opposite of morality. And I'd just like to add one more thing. I think Mr. Cobson said, making a moral decision, what does it say about you? Interesting, what does it say about you? Who's saying it about you? Where is this narrative that's recording what your moral decisions say about you? Is it society? Or is there always reference to a higher thing? What does it say about you? What if doing the right thing says the wrong thing about you? So who says what you do says about you? So this is a very interesting. There's always a reference to something higher than the individual, and I think you just can't escape the morality being greater than the individual.
Okay, Mr. Pollock, would you like to counter?
Yes, I'll add a couple of points. Our questioner is making the same mistake as those who interpreted Richard Dawkins' selfish gene as meaning that genes behave selfishly and therefore we all behave selfishly. This is a total misunderstanding of the metaphor in the title of his book. And he's also assuming that evolution has a purpose that we can divine and therefore adjust our actions accordingly. Evolution has no purpose. Evolution is blind, but we are the result of it. And we find ourselves in a situation where we've inherited from our past as social animals and our present as social animals moral feelings and capacities which we can now, from the advantage of our knowledge and our self-inspection, see are a set of rules that we have evolved so as to live happily together and live productively together. And having got that knowledge, we are now able to adjust our thinking about those inherited rules and say, well, things have changed a great deal. We've now got this far greater knowledge about how medicine works, about how science works, how the world works, and so on. We can tell that that is no longer a productive way of proceeding. And sure, moral debates are difficult. And sure, there can be two answers to questions, and there isn't necessarily a right one in some circumstances, in many circumstances. And sure, we can make mistakes. The Bishop of London, as well as Winston Churchill, were in favour of eugenics before the war. So were a great many people before the war. Medical doctors since the war have done terrible things from the best of motives. They've made mistakes. Doubtless we're making mistakes now. It doesn't alter the fact that our morality is inborn in our instincts derived from evolution, and that we now are conscious about it and are responsible, therefore, for tackling decisions about our actions in accordance with that system that we're part of.
Okay, would you like to talk on this topic, Father?
I'd just like to say, I do think evolution, I think morality evolves in that we learn from previous generations and learn to think more deeply about things, such as the abolition of slavery. For many decades, many centuries, we thought slavery was perfectly compatible with human dignity. And the death sentence, I think it would be very hard for us today to go to war, because we now realize more than we used to, the evil of killing.
Okay, time for the next question. We have a man at the right of that.
This one. Right, my one's a little bit vague. It's about society, and I'd like to draw the attention of the panel to Sweden. And I did get this from a meme, to be fair. It might not be scientifically correct, but as far as I'm aware, Sweden has an 85% atheist majority. So this is taken sort of from Abdullah's point stance. If a society has an 85% majority but isn't embroiled in chaos and gangbanging and all of that sort of stuff, how do humans need a higher power to behave in a civilized manner?
Okay, would you like to respond to that?
I think it's proposition.
Yes, yeah.
I think it's basically an assumption that if an atheist doesn't have a justification for his morality, that he's going to go buck wild and run amok. Basically, humans are great conformists. We conform to society. Society was bequeathed to us by previous generations, which built morality, and the previous generations of Europe were Christian. And so a lot of the morals, including, for example, the laws against incest, came from Christianity. Because I could argue, and this is a standard argument these days now, which is, if you have protection, what is morally wrong between a brother and a sister engaging in sexual intercourse, right? It's wrong according to law because we've got that from Christian morality in the previous generations. But also the statistics about Sweden, I've heard counter statistics saying that the majority said they were irreligious, but they believed in, didn't preclude spiritual beliefs, just not belief in a particular deity. I think even some were regressing back to some kind of Norse myths and so on and so forth. So I think it's been misrepresented when they said they were irreligious. It must mean atheist. Many people are irreligious, but they believe in horoscopes and many other things which the human society would not condone. So I think that that would probably answer, I think, the issue of Sweden. But I will follow up with a counterexample. According to a Gallup poll, societies which are less religious are more likely to have a high suicide rate than those who are more religious. And I know people might say, but that's because religion says that killing yourself is wrong. But doesn't that mean that then religion makes people want to live more than those who don't? So anyway, that's my answer.
Okay, would someone from the opposition like to respond?
Just a detail. I mean, thank goodness for Christianity that rescued all those Confucians and Hindus and Buddhists and Sikhs and so on from pervasive incest. No, not worth going further.
Okay, yes, on the left? Yeah.
So this is sort of driving the is-ought problem that Hume poses, so I just thought I'd bring this in because it wasn't mentioned during the debate. Let's say we can all agree that charity is a moral thing to do in general. Is the only reason to give to charity or to do good works in general to avoid eternal damnation on the case of the religious side here? Or why would a Christian do good if the only requirement for salvation is faith in Jesus Christ? On the side of the secular debates here, why would a secular thinker act morally at all if they have perfect morals? Why should they act morally? What? Just because something is moral, why should someone act in a moral way? Is that why we might need a God?
Okay, would Father Wansbrough, would you like to start talking about this?
This is the most sort of churchy question involving Christianity. It seems to me that if a thing is good, we can tell that it is good. We can tell that working for those who are in need is something which is worthwhile. And that's not restricted to Christianity, not restricted to the religious at all. It's a human factor. Within religion, those religions which have a God, there is the idea of reward and punishment, but that does not prescribe what is good and what is not good. But it's a persuasive thing to persuade one a bit more to do what one knows that one should do. But I don't think it prescribes the morality itself. It's a motive for being moral, but it doesn't prescribe morality.
Okay, and someone from the opposition on this question?
Let me say one thing. I mean, I've described. I think I've said why people without God, and indeed all of us, as Andrew said, actually behave morally. But I wanted to say one thing about religious morality. When I was up at Oxford, there was a mission to the university, and a man I admired a great deal, Trevor Huddleston, who did wonderful work in South Africa at the time under apartheid, led the mission. And in a question and answer session, he actually said, if I didn't believe in God, I couldn't think of any good reason why I should do the work that I'm doing. I found that shocking, and then I found that I just didn't believe him. But it does indicate the way that a religious belief can perhaps distort your thinking, and maybe that's an awful warning to those who are too devout. They shouldn't let their religion run away with their moral thinking.
Okay, we've got time for two more questions, so we'll have the girl at the back. Okay, and the man in the white shirt.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the enjoyable speeches as well. So my question is that on the basis of higher accountability providing morality, surely our legal system would provide morality, and if we need a creator with a purpose in mind to have morality, surely my creators, my parents, provide morality. I mean, you can prove the existence of God 100 times over, but that doesn't take you any closer to proving that we need him to have morality. All it shows is that someone has an opinion, a whim, a normative statement, just like any of us. So I would like to ask, please, what you have to say about that.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I doubt the legal system is both omniscient and omnipresent and always objective. It's because legal systems are imperfect. We need God. I think there's a saying basically that perfect justice is only with God. In this world, we only have the law. So I think that's where God has advantage over any human constructed society or justice system, because humans are imperfect. And the system can't monitor everyone's activities. I mean, for example, the opposition straw man, I think our side saying we use extreme examples of dictators and massacres and killings and so. No, just use simple. I use a very simple everyday example of envy between two girls. I can give an example of lying on your CV, for example. Everyone's doing it. If you don't lie, you're going to be disadvantaged. So don't you want to get a job? Won't you want to have a family and all these do these great things? So you have to lie on your CV. That will get you materially ahead. It doesn't hurt anyone, does it? You see, it's very easy, and many people, not pointing any fingers, but many people have succumbed to that. So, and as a last point, my opponent mentioned that the Christians didn't save the Hindus and Buddhists from obviously incest. But that's because Hindus and Buddhists are both spiritual traditions which outlawed incest, which is what these countries use to outlaw it. So you just actually argued for my position, not against it.
Okay, so yeah.
I mean, there have been very few societies where their assumed source of the law was either divine or otherwise that have ever normalised incest. I mean, this is not something that is the unique. In fact, I can only think of ancient Egypt. I can't think of any others. Can anyone else? No, maybe not. This first cousin marriage, of course, which is very common in many societies, and it still is, which is a sort of incest. It's not the direct incest that we usually think of when we're using extreme examples of brother and sister. I think that, your point isn't really directed towards us. Your question isn't really directed towards us. But I would certainly say that the law is not a reliable indicator of morality, and in fact needs to be constantly questioned, just like all moral principles do, against our own experience and of how it works and our own changing situation. But I think that it's useful to reflect on what law is, because I think that if you accept that law is a human creation, then you're going to start engaging with it, you're going to start thinking about it, you're going to start thinking about the consequences of one law or another, you're going to accept sometimes you change the law as we do in practice, and you're going to realise, I think, pretty quickly that is what morality is like, that morality isn't actually derived from single unchanging commandments, but actually is a process that changes. And I think that that's one of the things that undermines the idea that morality requires God, because gods do tend to be, quite single-minded and implacable in what they say. I can only think of Baha'is that believe in progressive revelation over time, and that God's still going, as it were, and still telling us new things. But other than that, religions tend to be frozen at particular points in time in the source of their authority, and that's a great error in morality.
They change, but actually they do change.
Oh, they change in fact.
But they pretend that they haven't ever changed.
Well, some religions obviously think of themselves as timeless.
If we now go to the girl at the back.
If morality is a social construct, and if that idea of morality is created from society, so from our history, from our laws, but that history and our laws is based in the ideas that we have about God, because God historically played a greater role in society, and many of our laws are based on, for example, the Ten Commandments or Sharia law in other countries. So therefore, isn't God inherent in our idea of morality, or society's idea of God inherent in our morality?
Well, you could say that the human idea of God was an important part of morality, and you could reread the motion as being something like, isn't an idea of God important to morality? And you could make a different set of arguments that had nothing to do with whether or not there was a real God or not, and there'd be something in what you said. But there would also be a large part of the world that, through its history and today, didn't rest their morality on any sort of God. If you think about both the theoretical and lived morality of the large majority of China until relatively recently, it rested on an entirely non-theistic idea of morality. And many societies across time have had that same thing.
a lot of biblical morality, Old Testament morality, is dependent on the Code of Hammurabi, and that is completely without any theistic basis, and was adopted into the Hebrews' way of thinking, because it just makes sense. It's natural morality.
I think I'll just conclude. Buddhism, although I think Buddhism just doesn't speak about the issue of God, doesn't deny the existence of God, doesn't speak about the issue of God. But when you look at the various tenets, I mean, the Buddha himself having ascended into kind of, enlightenment, and the Buddha itself becomes God actually to the Buddhists, as well as the idea of karma is almost like a panentheistic kind of conception of God. So they have their own conception of God, I would argue, but not in the way that a kind of Judeo-Christian Muslim would understand.
Okay, we actually have time for one more question. I was lying earlier. The man in the blue sweater.
I just want to say that if you take the Christian and Islamic principle of the beginning of time, going back to Adam and Eve, wouldn't you say that, regardless of who committed the sin, wouldn't you say that God acted morally to them equally and set them both down to earth, hence setting the standard of what morality is, and then that was given back onto us?
The story of Adam and Eve is not historical. It's an analysis of you and me. It's an analysis of the way we behave, the way we're tempted, the way we have human dignity, and the way we fall. And that is the value of it.
I would make a little disagreement on that, obviously, from a different religious perspective. But I don't think we need to bring in Adam and Eve to talk about morality, because even just being born into this world as a human being, each of us, it's our first experience of this world. And so, what is the relationship with us to God? God, we believe, created the entire universe as well as us along with it, and everything in this universe we believe follows the law. In a way, we don't really argue for morality, but rather that everything in the universe has a law. So everything follows, law. We call it physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. And humans have a law, our natural law, and following this law we call good, and not following this law we call bad. So there's no way of looking at that, but God created everything with a law, and everything follows the law. And so I suppose from that perspective, that is what we define as actually ultimately what morality is, following the law of our creation, like everything in the universe follows its own law.
Well, one of the things that story illustrates, of course, the Adam and Eve story from scriptures, if you read it in a certain way, certainly in the way that I would read it, is definitely the irritable and arbitrary nature of a great deal of a great number of different gods in all sorts of religious stories all over the world. And I think that's one of the things that makes it very difficult to ground any sort of morality in any sort of story of God, whether it's Zeus or the God of the Bible or any of the gods that are recorded sort of in the mythology of different societies as being so changeable and petty and arbitrary from time to time.
I disagree.
Well, I mean, it would be very difficult. It would be very difficult.
People saw it before. He's not irritable.
I think he's pretty well. He's not happy. Well, he's arbitrary. I mean, he's sort of arbitrary, selecting one thing over another. He's an arbitrary character. I mean, he doesn't appear arbitrary if you believe that he's God and that what he's doing is completely right, because of course it is. But if you read the story and see the people as characters, including God as one of the people, he behaves in what in a human would be an arbitrary way. And I think that you should judge gods by higher moral standards than you would judge even people. And on those standards, he certainly is arbitrary.
And as I said, it was the knowledge that he wanted his human creation not to have. It's similar to the Prometheus story, isn't it? Bringing fire, light, and enlightenment to humankind. And he was punished by the god of Sympathy.
It was, well, I regard the apple as being independence.
Yes.
That you can decide for yourself what's good.
So we should be servile. God wanted us to be servile, and we chose to be independent.
And we're punished.
And we're punished for it.
Why is not arbitrary.
In any sense, it's just one small story from one religion out of the whole range of thousands that there have been. And I think that, gods generally, whether you want to choose this god or that god, behave in this way because they're human creations based on, the behaviour of human beings. And again, that's a very shifting sand on which to try and build some sort of timeless authority.
We must now come on to the summaries. Every speaker will now have the ability to give a summation of their opinions and the way they thought the debate went. Due to tradition, the summations will be in reverse order. So to summarise the case for the opposition, I would like to call upon Mr. Cobson.
I'd forgotten we were doing summaries. I've got nothing left to say. I'll just sort of repeat some of the points that I've made before, I suppose. I think there are two ways of looking at morality. One is what people actually do. If you talk about the morality of someone, what you care about is whether they're behaving in a way that benefits other people or behaving in a way that harms other people. And so when you consider the question of whether or not morality requires a God, I think you have to say it doesn't once you recognise that millions of people, both today and in the past, have behaved sometimes in the ways that have benefited humanity the most, and have not done so because they believed in a God, but have not believed in a God. So in the sense that morality simply describes good behaviour, beneficial behaviour, the absence of harmful behaviour, I think it's self-evident that morality cannot require a God. You can then get into all sorts of theoretical discussions about what morality is, how we construct it, where it comes from, whether it needs some sort of external source. And I hope I made it pretty clear that I think that even if we're forced to descend to that theoretical level, there's still a strong case to be made that the existence of some extra-human, meaning external to human, experience, force, like a God, or like anything really that would be outside of humanity itself, is unnecessary. I think that morality, both originally through our biological and cultural evolution, and today, is generated by human beings. Today, we treat each other well because we see ourselves in the other. Morality is part of the process that occurs when we find ourselves of necessity in relation to other human beings who we can't, of course, live without. And I come back to saying that morality is a very complex thing. The word morality captures the constant need that we have to think about and reflect on what's right, what we're doing, what the effects of our actions are, to do so in a way that is informed by compassion and sympathy with other human beings. I don't think it requires anything external to human experience. And I think that if you do hold that it requires something external to human experience, I think you run the risk of contracting out your own moral responsibility to some other source and dehumanizing morality in the process. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for his speech and call on Father Wansbrough to summarise his thoughts.
I stand very much on the same side, in that I think that morality can be composed and defined and put together from human nature, from what sort of people we are. But I think it's worthwhile listening to the wise. And among the wise are some of the prophets, some of the people who have had a religious experience of some kind. Be very careful of religious experiences, but they must be sorted out and tested, and we can learn from them. And we learn from Jesus Christ, who had that extraordinary insight. We learn from others within the tradition, in our tradition. The Abraham and Moses are both those who have had insight and religious experience, but I think the basic idea of morality is from human nature and how human nature best works. So I think the God aspect is a help, but no more than that.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for his remarks and call upon Mr. Pollock to summarise the case for the opposition.
Hello again. Right. Well, first let me endorse what Father Wansbrough just said. Religion has been the vehicle for very much of mankind's most valuable thinking and moral insights. This isn't surprising because it has been dominant and universal in many societies. Nevertheless, it's through religious institutions, religious thinking, that much of our moral development, our moral thinking development has come about. That said, when you look at the world and you look at nations and see which are most religious and which are least religious, then you find that those that are most religious are those that have the most questionable moral behaviour. If you look at the United States, one of the most religious nations in the world, they have a huge rate of gun crime, of murder, of imprisonment compared with less religious societies. Their rates of illegitimacy, of any manner of social ill that you can think of, are higher by far than those of nations which have much less levels of religion and religious belief. And one of the worries about religion, of course, is that it sets something higher than human welfare. Why else are the Sunnis fighting the Shias and vice versa with such implacable hatred? Why else were the Israelis and the Palestinians at each other's throats? Why else are the Muslims and the Hindus implicated in so many massacres of each other in the Indian subcontinent, and so on? Why is Al-Shabaab murdering people in Kenya? It's because they're inspired by religion and they set their morality according to a god and not according to human welfare. Right. One last couple of thoughts that arise from what we've been talking about earlier. One of our questioners referred to the law as a source of morality. The law should not be immoral. The law should not require us to act immorally. But the law should definitely not try to enforce morality. This was an argument that we had back in the 60s with H.L.A. Hart debating with Lord Devlin. And the enforcement of morals by those who think they know best is a way to go to hell in a handcart, as I said before. And lastly, if you want to know something about how our moral behaviour actually works, then there is an excellent book by Matt Ridley called The Origin of Virtue, which shows the actual processes of thinking that people go through, and the way that in groups, in societies, they actually adjust the sort of selfish behaviour that they might conduct in isolation, so as to conform and to act morally.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for his speech and call on Mr. Al-Andalusi to summarise the case of the side government.
We heard distinguished opposition Andrew Cobson saying that we shouldn't contract our morality out to other higher powers. We ourselves should act by this morality. He's just successfully refuted the justice system, where we contract out the getting revenge on other people to an objective system that will look at it, check it, and do it for us. So this is an issue. What about the argument that God is arbitrary? All right, saying his argument is arbitrary. It's not arbitrary. He's rather consistent. So if God creates the universe and humans with a particular nature, he's going to give them commands which fit that nature. So the only issue is God consistent with his creation? So if he creates humans to do one thing, for example, it's like if I make a car and then I want the car to do tap dancing, it's going to be pretty inconsistent, right? But consistency is the issue, and God is not inconsistent. Mr. Pollock threw a few red herrings about terrorism, Shabab, and Sunnis and Shias. All of which can be answered by looking at the modern secular systems, which actually gave rise to these sectarian fights. Iraq never had this problem until the Americans came in and imposed democracy. upon the people. Shabab actually are using a secular system of warfare which has been used by many terrorist groups of a variety of denominations, both communist, atheist, anarchist, and so on and so forth, not related to religion. And their reasons that they give is about reciprocation. They attack and kill our civilians, we attack and kill their civilians. Very materialist. It's not based on, and Osama bin Laden said about the prohibition in Islam of killing innocents. He said, well, it's not that law. It's not set in stone. If they kill our civilians, we have to prevent them from killing our civilians. We have to retaliate and let them have the same taste of what they give to us. Osama bin Laden used a materialist argument, a secular argument, not a religious argument. He even negated the religious argument in order to give himself permission to do what he wants to do. As for USA, I think what you define about USA, it's not religion, which is perhaps the cause behind a lot of their moral turpitudes, as Americans would say, but rather they have a very rugged liberal system, very individualistic system, in fact. So I think you'd actually find a better argument there as to against liberalism rather than actually against religion. But what I would say is, unfortunately, in this day and age, it's very hard to look at the kind of religious societies that used to exist and were quite famed throughout history of providing justice, providing multicultural pluralism, which we saw, for example, in the Ottoman Caliphate, was very multicultural and pluralistic, gave different law systems to different people, something that secular states don't do today. One law for all, they say. It's very totalitarian. Unfortunately, they could. As for the issue, we can learn morality from human nature, I think Bentham just called the idea of learning morality from human nature nonsense on stilts. He tried to develop this idea of utilitarianism that has its own problems, which I won't go into. If you just look at the issue of morality itself, just look at morality itself. If you do something because there's ultimately some enlightened self-interest or ill self-interest, is that really moral? Is that doing something, is that moral? If there's ultimately something you want to achieve to satisfy some desire you have, then isn't this actually just being selfish and not actually being moral? And I'll finish up with saying, yes, there are differences of opinion amongst different religions and different scriptures. Yes, but there are also differences of opinion regarding theories explaining the universe. Does that mean now the universe doesn't exist or is not objective? Right? The question is, which religion, which theory works, and we have to investigate that. It doesn't negate the object it's talking about. And lastly, I will actually end my argument by quoting a famous atheist, Nietzsche, who was famous for nihilism, who basically said that atheists' imagination of morality being some kind of objective. This is one of the last anthropomorphisms of atheists, the ones that they still take from Christianity. And he wanted atheists to liberate themselves from these false notions that they kept from their Christian background, and said that there is, without God, that there is no morality. There's also no real objective truth. So I think that nihilists, I would say, are the only consistent atheists. And if they were here today, they would be on my side. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for his speech.